Thank you. It's great to be here. This has been a very encouraging and exciting meeting, and I think the good vibes reflect how much progress we're making in advancing understanding of metabolic disease and processes. At the same time, we still have lingering problems in acceptance of the science, and my talk, I think, will be somewhat more along the lines of Dr. Diamond's. So I've long been a critic of the medical literature. It's afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest. And we too often sculpt data to fit our preferred theory of the world, and most of all, the love of significance. I was jumped the punchline on this because I never talk like this. I would not say anything like this, at least in a professional medical journal. I might say it on Facebook. But this is from Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. And he describes a conference behind closed doors, which has actually been published, but his editorial in The Lancet tells most of the story. And he says, you know, maybe half of it's incorrect, and that he says there's a little bit of self-reference in what he talks about, in that he talks about the case against science, but as you see in the previous paragraph, it was supposed to be about biomedical research. It's not science that's the problem, it's biomedical research. And he says that a lot of it may be untrue, and they're flagrant conflicts of interest. That's where the previous quotations come from. His solution is that we should have much better statistics, which is this so-called sigma 5. This is what the title is about, and it's a very high precise p-value of 3 times 10 to the minus 7. Okay, this is Horton's editorial, and these are the problems that he delineates. The fact that a lot of it may be untrue and that they're flagrant conflicts of interest. His suggestion is on improving statistics, but the level that he's talking about is completely unrealistic, and that's not the problem anyway. But saying we need better statistics is blaming the author. He's the gatekeeper. Where is the gatekeeper? Flagrant conflicts of interest, he's supposed to catch those. So who accepts these tiny effects? And the real question, who can stop flagrant conflicts of interest? It's not the author.
It wasn't him, Charlie, it was you.
The editors are supposed to enforce the standards. That's the problem that we have in the literature, is declining standards, and they are supposed to enforce it. This is the big message in my talk, and it's where I think we can improve things, because we can now call the editors on failing to do their job. Interestingly, Horton's critique is not the only one. There are a whole bunch of these. This is from John Kroll, who's a surgeon, and one of the serious defects in the literature is this insistence on arbitrary methods like random controlled trials. And he points out that random controlled trials is not going to be a standard in testing surgery. And similarly, Michael Liebman points out that we tend to go with biomarkers rather than real biological processes. And the Atlantic was pretty blunt about what the problem is. The most widely cited, though, is John Ioannidis' article in which he suggested that maybe 50% of the literature is bad. I could never remember what PBV is. It's a really dumb acronym. It means positive predictive value. He describes what is wrong with the literature and how half of it may be bad. So the question is, what went wrong and who's to blame? The literature has 50% errors. 50% is not reproducible. Is this okay? Why isn't something done? Why do we accept this? Nobody seems to have a problem with this, and the literature continues in its usual way. Why is that? Let me tell you a joke. Guy walks into a grocery store and asks the clerk for a half a head of lettuce. The clerk says, I can't sell you half a head of lettuce. The customer says, sure you can, go ask your supervisor. So he goes in the back to talk to the supervisor, doesn't notice that the customer is following him. So he says to the supervisor, some jerk out there wants to buy a half a head of lettuce. And then he sees the customer and he says, and this gentleman would like to buy the other half. So if you say that half of the literature is bad, everybody thinks it's the other guys, that their stuff is right on target. And so the critiques are too general. They don't name names. They don't tell you who's really making the mistake. And we talk about evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based is a value judgment. And I usually make the observation that other areas in our society where we talk about evidence are courts of law. And in a court of law, somebody decides admissibility. You don't come in and say, this is the evidence. The judge has criteria as to whether the evidence is admissible. And if admissible, the opposition is entitled to vigorous cross-examination, and of course the jury decides whether the evidence is compelling. So my conclusion, and this is the main point of the talk, is that editors must recognize controversial papers, and they have to appoint reviewers from both sides of the controversy. That's how we got all of the papers that Dr. Diamond was talking about. They weren't adequately reviewed. And it took me a long time to figure this out, because the truth is that we don't know what the influences are. You can't accuse the author of taking money from the drug industry unless you have proof. And you can't even accuse them of being biased towards the philosophy of the department that they're in. They may be making a mistake. Even Einstein said that we all have to make sacrifices on the altar of stupidity. You can't accuse the author. The people that are at fault are the editors. The gatekeepers are not doing their jobs, and that gives us an avenue for remedy. So I'm going to consider several different criteria that we should use to consider what should be the standards in the medical literature, and I'll show you where they've been breaking down, and I'll give you an application of a common idea in analyzing epidemiologic studies. One of the problems we have is that the fault in a lot of the studies that are not solid science actually lies in the presentation. And the presentation can be so confusing that you can't tell whether the work is good. So I'm going to give you what may be a useful approach. I'm going to list 5 or 6 criteria that have not been met. Now, this is a paper from the Harvard School of Public Health, which says that red meat consumption and the risk of type 2 diabetes, and they look at 3 different cohorts, and they come to the conclusion that red meat consumption, particularly processed red meat, is associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And on the face of it, that's ridiculous. It has no underpinning in anything we know about biology or nutrition. It's not impossible. But the principle is that you don't start from scratch. You don't take everything off the shelf. And as somebody described a high school science project, I poured salt on it and it died. So you have to be serious about deviation from common sense and intuition, which requires strong proof. And this is why it doesn't make any sense. This shows you that during the in the past 30 years, as type 2 diabetes increased, red meat consumption decreased. Now, this is a letter I sent to the journal, and they actually did publish it. And I said that their so-called robust message was not it. I mean, it's very important, as Dr. Diamond pointed out. You got to look at the scale. So this is real changes. There was a big decrease in red meat, and as we all know, a big increase in consumption. In appearance of type 2 diabetes. The answer was that this ecological relationship cannot be used to argue against the causal relationship because many other factors have changed over time. And well, the idea that epidemiology is at a higher plane than ecology is probably debatable. But you can't say many other factors have changed over time. You have to say what those factors are. Anything could have happened. And in fact, there's compelling evidence that increasing red meat is causally related to risk of type 2 diabetes. Well, not so. There are many other factors have changed over time. So a subset of this is statistics is not a science. It always involves interpretation. You don't test everything. You have to have a criterion for testing it. And contrary to what is frequently said, the idea that observational studies generate hypotheses, it's not quite right. Observations generate hypotheses, but observational studies test those hypotheses. They have a hypothesis about red meat. So I usually quote the golden rule of statistics. This is from a book by Norman and Steiner called PDQ Statistics. And their point is that you should present the data. That the author has to make clear what the data are. They have to use graphs and standard measures before beginning the statistical shenanigans. The book is a little arch in its sense of humor, but quite a good statistics book. And they say that you should be suspicious if they don't do that. If they're not making it clear, you should be suspicious. But some of the principles in science have been codified. We don't. Science is a human activity. We don't have absolute. We don't have absolute criteria for what constitutes science. But Bradford Hill tabulated what are considered his criteria for when an observational study can be considered to be causal. And I recommend his president's address, which is very clear-cut. And he's very clear that this is not meant to be cut and dried rules to be followed, but rather things that follow from common sense. So I'll mention one or two of these. He said, strength, first upon my list, I would put the strength of the association. So Bradford Hill is the person who did the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And the way the work, he did this with Richard Dahl, and what they found they took surveys of physicians. Physicians, it turns out, are willing to, this was in the days of snail mail, were actually willing to send back a questionnaire. So what they found was 789 deaths, and 36 of these were attributed to lung cancer. When the lung cancer deaths were counted, all 36 of the deaths had occurred in smokers. So you didn't need any fancy statistics. What's interesting is that Dahl didn't believe it. That is, he didn't believe it when he started the study. He was a smoker, and he thought that it was not smoking, but I think he thought that evaporation from laying down highways was a factor. In any case, the important point is that he set out trying to study something that he didn't believe in, which was a good way to test it. When these data came in, he stopped smoking immediately. This is a quotation from Mukherjee's Emperor of All Maladies, which I recommend. So the strength of the association is most important to determining causality. I think that's pretty clear. Now, the corollary of this is that relative risk or percentage are almost always misleading. Relative risk, odds ratio, and hazard ratio, similar relative percentages. I'm going to take these as all roughly the same. It turns out that in the condition, most of the conditions in the medical literature, that's a pretty good approximation. But relative risk has been explained as misleading almost all the time. You know, Alice has 30% more money than Bob, but they both may be on welfare. And so that's almost always misleading. My new rule is habeas corpus datorum. Let's see all the data, the individual data. Don't take an average. You know, averages are inherently misleading, especially in nutrition, where you don't even know that the data follow the central limit theorem. That is, that they have a consistent peak, a bell-shaped curve. Some things are, information is destroyed when you don't see the individual data. The average of a Matisse painting is a green canvas. So here's the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease on a Mediterranean diet. So this is a very clear cut. It's actually very impressive because it was the most accessed paper in the New England Journal in 2013. And it says that among persons at high cardiovascular risk, a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil or nuts, reduced incidence of cardiovascular disease. So this is a very strong slide. Unfortunately, it now has the impact of having been picked up off the cutting room floor from Dr. Diamond's talk. And it shows you these, the data on the control diet versus the Mediterranean diets, and it has a hazard ratio of 0.7. So to me, that sounds pretty bad. People like different ways of interpreting things. I always like to hear it in, relative to 50-50. 50-50 are even odds. So I can give you a quick way of converting them. When they give you the odds ratio, you add 1 and take the reciprocal. So you take 1 over 1.7, and you get about 60% for the higher value. So 60-40 are the odds of actually getting better with the Mediterranean diet. The important thing, though, is that that's a two-tailed distribution. And what that means is that if you don't get better, you're going to get worse. So I don't know how much you would change your diet on 60-40 odds. But the real point is what Dr. Diamond pointed out. You got to look at you got to look at the scale. And to New England Journal's credit, they consistently show you the real scale, and that's it's 2%. And they actually show you the on a visually, graphically normal scale, and I don't know whether the results support the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. You have to look very closely. So this was my last slide last year, and that's what I'm going to talk about. These are the 4 horsemen of the statistical apocalypse: group statistics, relative risk, intention to treat, and meta-analysis. These are the things that are really wrong with the literature. So what is meta-analysis? Well, I had a blog post that asked the question, or answered the question, and it said that meta-analysis is to analysis what metaphysics is to physics. I got that from Bob Eckel, the former head of the American Heart Association, not otherwise known for his sense of humor. Anyway, as in the introduction, I'm a protein chemist, and I also worked in blood coagulation, and for whatever reason, I actually briefly worked in behavioral neuroscience. I've worked a little bit in a lot of fields in science. I never heard of a meta-analysis, and part of the reason is, I guess, generational, because when I tried to search PubMed, in 1970 there weren't any. And in 1980 there were 8, and by 1990 there were 100. This is a logarithmic scale, so the linearity means exponential. And then there were 700, and then there were a lot, and then now there are more than 10,000. So what is this? It's spontaneous generation. I mean, it's just somebody published one and then they started duplicating. But what do they tell you? They're supposed to compare, well, what a meta-analysis could be good. Well, a meta-analysis is good for 2 things. One thing that it is clearly good for is that if you collect a bunch of different studies, you can eyeball them and see whether they're consistent or whether we just don't know much. The thing that they were really designed for, though, is if you have a couple of small, underpowered studies, you hope that if you mix them together, you're going to see something that you didn't see before. So it's really a last-ditch, Hail Mary sort of approach. But the way it's used is to, and this was in that article on what is meta-analysis, and this is used to illustrate the meta-analysis. Now, the statistical rule is that if the error bar, the horizontal bar, crosses the 1 line, then there's no statistical difference. And they say that there's a reduction in 23% to this pooled meta-analysis value of about 0.4. But that crosses the line, and so does that, and so do all of them. There are only 2 studies that were statistically significant. And what does that mean? What it means is that what they're trying to do here is show that many wrongs can make a right. And it doesn't make any sense. So you could average small studies. A meta-analysis of large studies can say whether they're roughly consistent. But the problem is if they are consistent, you don't know any more than you knew before. Averaging them, I try to prove this mathematically someday, but it's obvious that the error gets worse, not better. But suppose they're not consistent. Suppose you have, and you see the meta-analyses with where one study is in one direction, the other is the other. And to think about that, consider the example of an emerging country building a railroad. Should they use a gauge to match the country to the north or the country to the south? And the parliament votes for a gauge that was the average of the two. So meta-analysis, that's the fifth rule, can show consistency, but you're lucky if you get anything beyond that. So I'm going to go back to this red meat paper, and I'm going to suggest a way of analyzing the data, and that hopefully simplifies it. And to do this, I'm going to give a demonstration, which many of you may have seen before, and I'm going to ask you to solve a problem in diagnosis. And I'm going to show you about interpretation of statistics and how you frame the problem. Okay, the probability that a woman in a particular population has breast cancer is 0.8%, 0.8%. If a woman has breast cancer, the probability is 90% that she'll have a positive mammogram. Now, if a woman does not have breast cancer, the probability is 7% that she'll still have a positive mammogram. So if a woman tests positive on a mammogram, what's the probability that she actually has breast cancer? Now, some of you may have seen it, but sometimes even if you have seen it, it starts to give you a headache almost immediately. And it's, elementary mathematics to figure it out, but it seems really hard. And I'm going to assume that most of you are still thinking about it. And I'm going to ask you now to reconsider the problem with the same data presented in a different way. I'll tell you now that 8 out of every 1,000 women have breast cancer. Of the 8 women with breast cancer, 7 will have a positive mammogram. Of the remaining 992 women who don't have breast cancer, about 70 will still have a positive mammogram. So I now ask you, if a woman tests positive, what's the probability that she has actually has breast cancer? And the problem becomes immediately obvious. 8 women have breast cancer, the mammogram finds 7. The test also finds 70 false positives, so there are a total of 77 positive tests, and the accuracy is about 9%. So what was a difficult problem because of the way it was phrased becomes extremely simple. Frequently it's shown in a flow diagram. This is from a popular statistics book called Calculated Risks, which I recommend. And the method is referred to frequently as natural frequencies, and it shows you, again, if you have 1,000 people and 8 have disease and 992 don't have disease, you can immediately see how many fulfill conditional probability. That is, they both have disease and test positive. And so this is the illustration from Gigerenzer's book. It is usually said to be derived from Bayesian statistics, which is true, but you don't really need Bayesian statistics. Frequently it's taught as making a 2-by-2 matrix, because what you're asking about is conditional probability. What is the meaning of the positive test if you have disease? And in here you put the true positives. And in diagnosis, when you're using this as a diagnostic test, the ratio of positive tests to the total is called the sensitivity. And the ratio of the true negatives to the total is called the specificity. So I'm going to suggest that the approach is general. It's not specifically diagnosis, and can I apply this to the red meat study? After all, in some sense, what they are asking is, if I see you eating a lot of red meat, I'm taking that as a sign that you're going to develop diabetes. So here's Pan's study, and he followed 37,000 men. When you look in Table 1, one of the problems with all of these studies is that they have few figures and a lot of mind-numbing tables, and it's pretty hard to actually extract what you want to know. But here we know that the highest meat consumption, there are 72,471, 7,247. And so the four in the right-hand corner, this is your 2x2 matrix. I'm putting in the numbers that you can extract from the paper to get those numbers. So you look on Table 2, and they do tell you the number of cases, and the number of cases in Q5. The fifth quintile is the one that it's the highest meat consumption. So you can put that in the table. Now you can add up all the other people who don't eat a lot of meat and add that to that, and then you get the total. That is the cases for all of those. The total cases then are 2438. And then you can, with all the total data, you can get all the relevant information. So then let's do the flow diagram of the type that Gigerenzer did. So if we have 1,000 men, this is the health professionals. These are all men or doctors or health professionals. Of 1,000 men, it says that 66 of them have type 2 diabetes and 934 don't. Of the 66, 18 are high meat eaters and 48 are not. And similarly for type 2 diabetes. So this just summarizes 66 cases, high red meat, quote, caught, if it were a diagnostic test, we would say the high meat caught 18 of them, and then there are 178 who don't have diabetes. So as a diagnostic test, the sensitivity of high red meat consumption is 18/195, or 9%. And that's different than what happens when you read the paper in terms of your state of mind. The test has high specificity. That means that if you are diagnosed for not consuming red meat, there's every chance that you're not going to get diabetes. Of course, if you do consume a lot of red meat, you're probably not going to get diabetes either. High specificity isn't enough. That's just the actual numbers past that. So how do they get such good numbers? I mean, the actual age-adjusted model gives 1.79. So if you use my add 1 and take the reciprocal, I can't do that, about 65/35. But even that is a lot better than that 9% that we came up with. So what do these numbers mean? Now, you understand that we have, that when you do this kind of study, you have to adjust for confounders. If you show that people get fat on a high carbohydrate diet, you have to first correct for the total calories before you can say that. So they correct for a few things. Cigarettes and smoking status, family history of diabetes, hypertension. I'm not making this up, that's in the paper. And dietary score. Now, I have this quotation from Walter Willett who says, there's no distinction between confounding and explanatory variables. What he means there is very important, because if you have to correct with all these things, if you correct red meat with smoking, that's the same thing as correcting the risk from smoking with the risk from red meat. So you don't know what is the major controller. I'll tell you another joke. So the woman calls the police because the guy across the street is exposing himself. And the cop shows up and he says, "Lady, that window is too high. I can't see anything." And she says, "Oh, well, sure, where you are, but stand on this chair and you'll see what I'm talking about." If you have to do all this stuff to get the right answer, something's suspicious. Okay, those are the rules. I'm running short of time, so I'm just going to charge ahead. Because what can be done, I'm going to give you the example of what can be done from an interesting article in the New Yorker about a cop who was involved in exonerating a prisoner who he had helped convict because he saw that the evidence was not produced well and additional evidence came out later. And what the article says, he had doubts about the work in the NYPD. He hated having to abandon an investigation after an arrest was made, and he preferred federal methods which didn't consider that case closed until pleas were entered or trials took place. And what I'm getting at here is that, and this was even mentioned by Horton, we need post-publication review. And what that may mean is we need to go back and reevaluate papers. And the reason to see this is that the post-publication review that we get, now PubPeer is one of the institutionalized studies, and David Ludwig is a person with credentials and experience in this field, and if he's criticizing the paper, that's evidence that it didn't get good review to begin with. Well, this is a thoroughgoing critique of the paper. And this came in my mail, and this was a case of possible fraud, but I just happened to notice it. So that is the problem. And the editors have to shoulder a new burden. And the possibility is we have to go back and reevaluate things. We have to go and call the journals on what they've published. And my colleagues in English departments say that self-reference is the sign of art. And this is Horton's latest editorial, in which he's concerned about the efficacy and safety of statins, that the controversy on that is harrying the health of potentially thousands of people, and he has a review trying to settle the matter. So he's clearly on one side, and that's not a good thing, because it makes clear that the role of the gatekeeper and the campaigner, which is what he is here, shouldn't be confused. And I think, I hope what I brought out here is not a consistent plan yet for what can be done, but at least who the culprits may be.
It was you, Charlie.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you.